we go. 1, 2, 3.
You are listening to Thinkative, the podcast for philosophers, seekers and the generally curious. I'm Tim Newton.
I'm Matt Parker as always.
Over there is Jason Reed.
Hello.
On the visuals behind the scenes is Gavin Eriksson. And we are joined today, I'm very pleased to say, by artist, activist, broadcaster, Bob and Roberta Smith, who has very kindly come along and brought a beautiful bottle of Roc de Lussac for us to pour and drink while we are discussing art in its myriad forms and personal forms and all of that. We're not quite sure where it's going to go, but
we'll see.
We will see. So welcome, Bob.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be here, Tim.
It's great. And
Before we dig into things, shall we go ahead and pour the wine?
I think we should.
Oh, yes.
I'll
You want
make
to do
a
the-
start.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll be mother.
I'm interested to see what this is like. Actually.
Yeah. Well, it's been breathing for a good 15 minutes now. So,
Yeah. It's not that I
You think that makes any
found this
difference?
yeah.
While we're pouring it, it's a good point to mention that if you are tuned in on Facebook, send us some questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll
Or
try and keep an
comments,
eye.
or-
Comments, questions,
or just
all,
naughty
thought,
pictures.
art,
We've got
send us
it.
some
Yeah.
pictures.
But yeah, so great, lovely. I am pouring this yet to.
Now, Bob, I'll call you Bob. Some of our, if anyone saw the sort of teaser that we posted last week, they might be disappointed to find out that there's only one Bob and Roberta Smith. How did that? I love the name. I love the idea of getting used to calling one guy Bob and Roberta.
Yeah.
But where does that come from? What was the idea there?
Well, it comes from an idea, really a philosophical question, really, which is that art is all about individuals' experience in a way that writing novels isn't. So I thought it would be interesting to think of a fictitious artist and try and promote that fictitious artist. And it turned into a duo. And originally the artist was Bob Smith, and I thought I'm going to promote Bob Smith as an artist. And actually I sent out lots of different slides. I was living in New York, and I sent out lots of different slides to lots of different galleries. And the slides that I got the best response was the Bob Smith group of slides.
Ah, okay.
And so I thought, well, I'm going to go with that. so I stopped making my figurative paintings and went with the more conceptual work. And but it was a sort of move that was happening anyway. And so the idea was that I would really, when you think about Van Gogh, you think about Van Gogh chopping off his ear, or Tracy Emin's bed, or you think of Michelangelo ruining his back at the top of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. You think about all these myths, don't you? And actually, they're rooted in truth, but they're rooted in the idea that it's the artist's experience and their life that creates art. And I thought, well, it would be quite interesting to bring fiction into that. So how do you bring fiction into it? And I thought, well, quite a good thing to do would be to come up with a fictitious artist duo and go with that. So for a long time, I pushed that idea. And
were you keeping yourself secret, or were you quite openly going, I am inhabiting these two people, it is me that's doing it?
Well, it morphed as you pushed it out into reality. So then I began to talk about it like it was 007 or Doctor Who, and actually over time anybody could be this, and could be Roberta Smith. So for a time I had a Japanese couple who were being Bob and Roberta Smith-san, and I had a German couple being Bob and Roberta Smith in Germany, and they were producing work and exhibiting it. I mean, they did it once or twice. Didn't really catch fire, but they did do it, and they used to send me slides of their new Bob and Roberta Smith work, and I thought that was great. but as a career idea,
Yeah.
that's a disaster. I should have stuck with my real name, because it just confuses things. And there is a reason why artists use their real names. It's because it's based on their real experience. And if you go against that, you're screwed.
But that's quite an interesting sort of fundamental idea, though, that art is. I mean, you know, because what I was thinking about as we were working up to this program was going, art is a lot of different things to a lot of different people.
Yeah.
But and you can't really boil it down to one thing necessarily, or can you? But the thing that you latched onto was art is an expression of the personal human experience of the artist. Is that
absolutely?
I mean,
it's hard to get around that. It's not something I particularly. It's a sort of fact.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, and of course there are collaborative ventures making art, and of course if you then go into design, you have architects working together producing design. But
we're talking about art with a capital A.
We're talking about fine art.
Yeah, fine art.
And that is largely, you've got a couple of books there about art. They're about individuals and their experiences, because it's based on the idea that you're sitting in a space, or maybe the Pope has told you to do this amazing biblical story or something, but it's down to you to do it.
Well, there
might have
there's
assistance,
right,
but it's down to you.
Yeah, right. Well, there's this sort of image of the mythic artist as this sort of lone genius, right, or this lone visionary. I've never really thought that art was very much about the artist's story, really, though, but more about the artist's sort of personal vision. Does that make sense?
Well, the artist's story in contemporary life, in contemporary art, and that's the word I have to cope with.
Sure.
That's become increasingly important in the last few years. Because we have the idea of the YBAs and Damien Hirst being a working class kid, cutting off somebody's head and being seen next to it. And in my period, it's really interesting. It's changed. When I was a kid, art on telly used to be like watching foxes through infrared lenses, or badger watching or something like that. There used to be like natural history programs. You were watching artists and seeing them go about their business. And but now on TV, if artists on TV, they have to author the program. They almost have to present their show about themselves. You see Grayson Perry on TV, he is presenting a show. It's about other people, but it's actually about him. He's required to do that. So our place in the media certainly has changed, and I think the public imaginations have changed over the last few years.
So you're
personally, I don't think that is a very good thing. I'd rather go back to the badger watching days.
Would you like to be observed like a beaver at work on a dam?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Through binoculars. Yeah.
Look at that clever beaver building that dam. It's amazing, these beavers. No, that would be because then you've got people, talking about you, rather than you
talking about yourself.
Yeah, yeah.
It's always hard to sell, right?
Well, the problem with that is that it interrupts the discussion between the audience and the artwork. Really, as an art, I know probably people would disagree with me, but on some level, you want the audience not to have a conversation with you or think about you. You want them to experience the artwork that you've made.
Not through the prism of the individual, which has become really prevalent. I mean, Tracy Emin, case in point, very powerful presence in what she does. You look at Tracy Emin's bed, and you can't you've taken Tracy Emin out of it as a figure, but she's made that.
Yeah, because you want to I mean, I don't know if it's a philosophical question or not, but you want the viewer to have an experience with the artwork that you made. If you have to deal with the individual artist as well, what you're really showing is celebrity memorabilia. You're showing Johnny Nicholas money box. You're looking at David Bowie's trousers or something.
Yeah.
You want to listen to the music. The reason why we love David Bowie, I mean, he was an amazing kind of character. Yeah. But actually, the music.
Yeah, and that's music being art, undeniably. I mean, I don't separate, you know, the experience of listening to music, say with Bowie, not with everybody, but with Bowie, you've got an intensely personal connection with that music and the story that, you know, with Ziggy Stardust, say, for example.
And it's your story as well.
Your story, you go, you know, and I remember being 17, walking into that party, hearing that music for the first time, whatever, when I first heard it, and just going, what the hell is this? This is unbelievable. And but it's a very intense and direct connection, and then, you know, then you put Bowie in there because you get to know him. But that's, you know, with the great art, like you say, well, with the best experiences of art you have, it's a very personal connection between. It's like there was for me. I saw oh my God, who's the guy who's done all the figures in Margate, standing looking out to sea?
Anthony Gormley.
Anthony Gormley, yeah. Okay, and think what you like about Anthony Gormley, but there's a figure he's done that's looking out to sea, and you go into this lonely little arcade, and you see this figure looking out to sea, and there's a sort of a presence in the atmosphere.
It was Folkestone, too.
Yeah, Folkestone. In Folkestone. And it's really, and I went, oh, what's nice is that he's forcing me to put, it's 2 and 2, which is me and that, and I'm making the 4. You know what I mean? And there's no one in the middle of that.
Although with Anthony Gormley, you've got to remember, that's a cast of him.
Yeah.
He's inserted himself into the artwork.
So,
literally, that's him.
That's him.
But I see, I know what you're saying, you're right, yeah.
But he still injected himself into it very much.
He's injected himself into that, but that analogy is something that is shifted a lot. And I think as a contemporary artist, you have to recognise is that people are going to be, you know, in a way, because art, like everything else, is now, you know, there's a process of demystification. Well, art depends on a bit of mystification.
Definitely.
It depends on a bit of, you know, kind of holding things back. It's like what you're saying, like this Kuleshov effect you were talking about, weren't you?
Yeah, editing. Yeah.
Yeah, that you know, you're comparing one thing with another, and then you're making, you've got the result is happening in your brain, not you're not being told it.
Yeah, just very quickly, the Kuleshov effect, you can look it up. It's a film that was made in 1917, which shows a very neutral actor just looking out past to the camera, and then that's intercut with different scenes: a bowl of soup, a dead body in a coffin, and a young woman. And every time it cuts back, although the expression is exactly the same, the audience projects onto that actor the emotion that the audience is feeling. So it's lust or hunger or a sense of grief, depending on what that's cutting back to. And yeah, we project.
Which is why Keanu Reeves can get away with being in movies.
Oh,
right?
totally.
Because all you have to do is cut away to something else and you project something, some thought on it.
Yeah, that's how a lot of people work, but that in itself is a gift, that neutrality, in the same way as
To be blank.
to be blank.
Well, it's like, and you see, I think when, I mean, this is an interesting thing for me. It's probably of no interest to anybody else. I'm sorry about that. I did make this programme for BBC 4, and all the time they were saying, "Tell us what's happening in the next scene. Tell us what we're going to be doing tomorrow." And I you know, I adopted a very kind of deadpan artist idea about it. I said, "Well, I don't know what we're going to be doing tomorrow," you know, and actually that was very difficult. And I realised that part of the shtick as an artist that I want to hang on to is almost that Buster Keaton idea. Maybe it's the reason why I wear a hat, you know, that as an artist you walk into a situation and you react to it.
Yeah.
If you're there saying, I'm going to go into this situation now and this is going to happen, I think that takes something away from the viewer. You know, it stops the viewer working to try and think and actually looking. That's about looking, isn't it? You have to look and make your own
Like
judgment.
a footballer. You know, in a game of football, you're reacting to what's going on, and in a way, that's a purer form than if you're storytelling. You know, because you've laid out what you are going to want to say.
But isn't that what human beings do, Tim?
Yeah.
Matt?
What
We look and we
React.
We look and we react, yeah.
we react.
But sometimes we look and react in private and develop things and plan and create a work and then force it onto the world and then cry at the bad reviews.
Yeah.
But so I mean there are these different approaches to art, right? Sometimes you can do things that's very reactive and improvisational, but also there's some value in planning a grand work, isn't there?
Absolutely, yeah. But that, in a way, that planning is, you're making a response to something. Right?
Yeah.
You're making a response to the world, and trying to understand.
And a work, like, for example, there's a work you did which is a transcription of an interview you heard on Radio 4 about the Syrian bombings.
Yes.
Which was a huge piece of work in which you transcribed the interview. But that was your reaction to that interview, and you were channeling your angry reaction into that work of art. And so people stood there, and what you did, I remember with that, it was very simple, black on white text, nothing fancy about it, very, very simple.
Yeah, but that was an amazing thing to do. That was quite a dark thing to do.
Yeah.
Because it was, I should tell that story a little bit. But David Knott, who is, he did an amazing interview with Eddie Mayer. I think it's a genius kind of interviewer. He does these long form interviews. But he did an interview with him where it started off quite innocuously, where he's growing up in Scotland, and he said he wasn't very good at school, and he failed a whole load of exams. And his father, who was a surgeon or a doctor, told him, you've just got to retake those exams, and he worked and retake them, and he went to medical school, St Andrews. So it's kind of a long story, but then he trained as a pilot, and he said the thing about being a pilot is that people think that's exciting, but for a long time it's very boring. And he only enjoyed it when things started to go wrong. But then the interview turned to his volunteering for Médecins Sans Frontières and various different NGOs, and doing surgery in war zones, and then he spent that autumn, I think, in Aleppo, and he'd seen some terrible things. But one of the things that he had to do was that he had to perform surgery on these people who had to go across the front line. And there were two aspects to this which were very dark. One was that these snipers, women and children, were going across a front line to go and buy vegetables and fruit and vegetables. And one thing that was very dark about it was that the snipers were shooting, they were taking, they had different themes on different days. So they were shooting pregnant women on a Wednesday, they were shooting children on a Thursday, shooting boys on a Friday, so they're playing a game, really. And he would have to be operating on these people, and he would only have one kind of person in on a particular day. And the next thing, which was very dark, where the interview completely ground to a halt, was that he said they just don't have the kind of medical equipment that he has in London. And so they have these, in a surgical theatre, they have these curtains which catch the blood, and somehow they siphon it away. And but in Aleppo they don't have that. So the blood just went on the floor, and then after every operation, a man came round with a brush like in an abattoir and swept it away. And what happened in this interview is that Eddie Mayer was actually kind of choked, and there was silence on Radio 4. And actually, what was quirky about it is that it was on New Year's Day, and I drank rather a lot on New Year's Eve, and I turned on Radio 4, listened to the PM programme, but I'd fallen asleep. When I woke up, it was this silence, and I said, crikey, I thought I had the radio on. And then I heard the end of the interview, which was amazing, and then I listened to it again on iPlayer and heard the build up to it, and then there was another part the next week, or the next day. But this interview, it is an extraordinary thing, and David Knott, what he does is amazing, but he is a really kind of inspirational kind of character. And I thought, and this is turning into a long shaggy dog story, but one of the things that was important to me when I was a kid was that I came across the idea of the Holocaust through the Richard Dimbleby memorial album, and it has Richard Dimbleby broadcasting about the spaghetti harvest and things like that. But then Richard Dimbleby was also the first person into Belsen, really, one of the first people he broadcast from Belsen, and it was that thing about, well, actually there's an experience, but it's been made into a physical object. And I thought, well, maybe I can make David Knott's interview into a physical object. and I spent 4 months transcribing it and painting it onto these panels, and then I was able to show it at the Royal Academy, and we got David and Eddie Mayer to come and see it, and it was an amazing thing.
Yeah, it's really powerful. But it's meant to be reductive over what is obviously like a really emotional thing. That's where you were actually using, capturing emotion there and conveying emotion and eliciting emotion in the audience or the viewer to that piece of work. You wanted to transmit that feeling that you had via that artwork.
Yeah, I saw a quote. Somebody was trying to define art, and they said that art is when you have an emotional experience and you try to convey it to someone else. That was somebody's.
Which is a reductive way of looking at it, but it's one of the ways.
Well, I think I think about this a lot, and I think one of the things is also getting a bit older and realising, not that time's immediately running out, but you want to take what you do a bit more seriously somehow. And when I was a kid, I wanted to get a reaction out of people. I wanted to provoke people. Or when I was younger, I wanted to do that. And then one of the things that I've realised over time, that the key thing is to try and make an object that is inspiring. That's the thing that you want to do. So it's not necessarily want to inspire people to do art, but you want to make something that's inspiring. And I think when you hear, I keep going back to music because it's more obviously operates in this way. But for me, when I see the key artworks that I really love, which are things like the Escargot, Matisse's Escargot that's in the Tate, which is so joyous, or things like, or quite doomy things like Rothko's room that's in the Tate Gallery, which I've known all my life. I find those things as inspiring as, in a way. I mean, this sounds completely pompous, but in a way, the attempt is to try and make something visual, like Otis Redding screams, "I can't turn you loose." It makes a piece of music. You want to make something that makes your bristles go up on the back of your head and go, "Wow!" I don't want to copy what they're doing, but I want to do something myself. And I think that is, that's become my measure of, what's interesting as art. Whether you go, "Wow, that is really," almost want to loosen my neck here and I want to rock out to this painting.
Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting because it reminds me of what Tim was saying earlier about David Bowie, and listening to Bowie's music and like, so there's the character of who he is and all the characters he invents as well. But you were saying what really got you is the music. Now music is this much more sort of directly visceral aesthetic experience, at least pop music, right? I mean, you have John Cage and things like that who are done, who've done much more conceptual things. But like pop music, you have this direct sort of felt aesthetic experience, right? And some people have thought that that's what art is. That art is creating an aesthetic experience. But then there's a lot of art of the 20th century, and that doesn't seem to do that, or maybe does it in a different way. But some philosophers argue that art doesn't have to be aesthetic. And some have thought that even art should be more conceptual than aesthetic, and that it can convey concepts and understanding. Talking about art in the sort of broad modern sense.
But I certainly think that maybe that measure of the idea of it being inspiration doesn't have to be kind of, sort of visual and visceral and kind of humanistic in that kind of way. It can be, kind of an intellectual kind of thing. I mean, I certainly think that if you read, I don't know, certain texts, they are, they're inspiring things. And I think art more conceptual art, in a way operates on that.
Well, you've got some you have some very direct concepts in what you do. For example, like art is your human right. It's about an idea.
Yes.
It's not necessarily. I mean, you might go yes, and you follow on from that idea with a kind of like, yes, and I shall go out and I shall do art, for example, you know, so you follow with an emotional response. But quite often you could simply be going, you know, all art schools should be art schools, or art is really important, whatever, you know, in a reductive way. But so there's also this trend, like Matt's saying, that it's purely a cerebral experience when you look at, like film can be, you know, you can look at a film and it can be a very engaging cerebral experience. And you can look at another film and it can just get you in the gut and you can respond to it really emotionally.
But there have been cases where artists and art theorists will claim that the work of art, in a given instance, isn't any particular object, it's the concept that's behind what's being presented, that the actual work isn't something that you can touch, but just something conceptual.
Well, you see, I've wanted to try and say that aspect, maybe it's corrupting that idea, but I've wanted to say that aspect is a kind of campaign. You know, the idea that the artwork is a kind of artifact, and that the effort around it, maybe it's a conceptual and intellectual effort,
or artifact in the sort of epiphenomenal sense, like it's not really central. Is that what you mean by an artifact?
Yeah. So the art object. Well, the art object can inhabit both spaces actually, but the idea of that the art object is part of a wider project, and we do think about artists, projects, particularly in ideas around minimalism and Carl Andre and stuff. We do think about it in those terms, and I think that's, and what I've wanted to say is not to keep that a rarefied, a kind of art theoretical thing, but actually say it's a political thing, and to say, well, actually, a campaign like the Art Party, or trying to stand against Michael Gove, to say, well, that's an artwork. I'm saying that this is an artwork. It has no, it's got a few trinkets dotted around it, but it's what I'm doing here is art. So it's kind of a light, it's kind of
action or something you've been involved with that you think of as an artwork.
Well, I think it's slightly disingenuous because sometimes it's a bit after the fact. But one of the, it's again to give people agency, to give people some sort of sense of agency. So one of the things we did, which was very, very successful actually, was to highlight the fact that that Henry Moore's Old Flow sculpture was actually a kind of peace sculpture. So we were saying, that Henry Moore's, this sculpture which has come back recently to London, it's in the Canary Wharf now. One of the things was the council were trying to sell that. So this was a piece of activism, really. We were trying to say, we were trying to tell a story about that sculpture which had been completely forgotten. Now that sculpture is a kind of amorphous bronze female figure, which I suppose as people have forgotten about Henry Moore's drawings of people sheltering from Nazi bombs, which that figure is based on, they've forgotten that story, but they don't realise that actually Tower Hamlets, quite important for Henry Moore to have that in Tower Hamlets, because it was Tower Hamlets where the bombers were dropping their bombs because they wanted to get the docks. And Henry Moore wanted that sculpture, which was a sculpture of an Eastern End woman sheltering from those bombs, to go back and symbolise peace in that area. And
all should have forgotten. It's just a
all that being forgotten, and the auction houses were telling Tower Hamlets Council, well, that's that's just a very valuable bronze lump, and it would, if we sold it, we could minimise your deficit. That was completely immoral in my book. So we constructed this thing where I invited my students to dress up as Henry Moore's Old Flow sculpture, so in a kind of verdigris green outfits. And then this is the thing. This is where all the campaigning stuff started for me. Was that and it was the beginning of my adoption of Twitter and social media, and I realised I sort of thought, what would happen if I tweeted images with with the hashtag #SaveOldFlow as I went to buy my own outfit and go and get my green tights so that I would be dressing up as this character as well. And I did that, and what happened was, when I turned up at the station, there were my students, but there were also 20 other, mostly women, dressed up as Old Flo. Wow. 2 of them had gone to, do you remember them? They got to make amazing outfits, and they had followed that hashtag. And it was I suppose it's to do with social media, but I suddenly realised that, in a way, I mean, of course, they're turned on by the idea of the campaign and the crazy injustice of it. But actually, there's something that is akin to an artwork in that, because again, it ties in a little bit to this idea of inspiration, but it has no form. You know, the social media message, that person thinking something, and then having the commitment to turn up, make their own outfit. I thought that was probably more important than some of the physical art objects that I've made. Just the ether. I don't know how to describe it, but the only way I can describe it is the campaign. And somehow that campaign took on board the idea of it, it being an artwork. And so I then began to, and Tim brilliantly filmed it, and then that film got shown, and it became part. And actually, just recently, it was successful. That sculpture, it remained in the public domain, and it has come back to London, and it is now in the... So, and I think there were other people involved in that, bigger agencies than just us, but it made me think, well, actually, you can actually do something really good with art. You can actually, people say you can't do anything with art, and it just sits there, but I thought, actually, that was the first instance where I actually did something.
Yeah, well, art became a call to action, really.
Art became a call to action.
But that's also a really interesting example, because I think what you're saying is it wasn't really intended as a work of art to begin with.
So no, it wasn't.
So then it
heuristically evolved.
So then it seems like, okay, so then it's not a criterion for something being a work of art that it's intended as a work of art, right? It could start out as something else.
Ah, that's a good idea, yeah.
And even something as abstract and conceptual as a kind of performance with what do they call it, crowd?
Flash mob.
Yeah, flash mob type of thing.
Yeah. Well, that's
so
why.
what are the kids called? The flash mob.
You see, that's why that's why art's communicative. You see, that's why it's so important that the audience are involved, and that they feel that they have, that they should be involved. And that's why we want more children to have art in their lives in schools, and we want more kids to embrace it, because that is about ownership of ideas. That's how you get people to think, well, actually, this thing that I don't understand, that could be important. Let's bet on that idea.
What's also good...
Let's bet on children's intelligence.
Yeah, which is, a whole other chapter where, where your work's going at the moment. But this idea of the artist's concept of what art is evolving over time is interesting. In a way, in the same way, if you talk about a conceptual artist or someone who's working with ideas and what art means, and then playing with what art means to create calls to action or whatever, protest, then it's a similar way to watching someone who's got a more aesthetic approach to art. Classically someone like Picasso or whatever, you watch his style evolve, because what the quality of the art that he makes means is changing for him over time as well. So it's not fixed.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as an artist, you don't really want to do the same thing over and over. But as an artist, also, and as a person, you grow. You grow and you think about things in different ways, don't you? I mean, and also, I suppose for me, I didn't have an early break, or particularly, so I think that's been actually quite a good thing. I've kind of tried to, understand how ideas and objects and society through my art, really. You know, it's been a very evolutionary practice.
There was a philosopher, White's, who, inspired by the later Wittgenstein, argued that the concept of art is one of these concepts that's, he called it an open concept. It's similar to, there's another philosopher, Weissmann, who used the term open texture for these sorts of concepts, where it's a kind of concept that has, it's not only vague, it has sort of like that we're repeatedly confronted with cases where we have to make a choice whether we want to extend the concept of art to cover that or not.
Mm.
And so we're kind of playing it by ear as we go along. Something comes along like your event with the costumes and the statue, and then you have to make a choice. Do I want to include that in the concept of art or not? And by that means the concept of art itself grows and changes.
I think that resonates with me. I mean, I think, and I think that phenomenon, that's very important for humanity, isn't it?
Mm.
You know, this idea that you have to be porous isn't the right word, but you have to be able to ask yourself those questions, even when you think when you're confronted with a load of things which you think are certainties. And that's very difficult. You see, that's
It's
what
funny you
politicians can't confront. Really.
yeah.
Artists can.
Well, some of them can. Wittgenstein got a grip on it, and it's funny there was
politicians, not philosophers.
not-
I think philosophers are quite good at it, probably.
Yeah.
I thought you said logicians.
Logicians.
Oh yeah. But that's just that's my fault.
That's why you're
But I
there.
just want to say you said porous, but actually the Austrian philosopher Weissmann, who developed this concept of open texture, that was a translation of his German term, and his German term was porosität, or porosity, for the character of these concepts that have this sort of openness in them, that they have to be extended.
It's very interesting because every day, not every day, but 2 days a week, I go and teach in an art school, and you see students. Sometimes they trip over that barrier. I think they can trip over that barrier at quite a young age. Actually, they can go. It's to do with curiosity as well. You can go. Oh, I see. I don't understand that, and I found it fantastic. No, I don't understand it. You know, there's such a lot. I don't know about it. I don't want to know about it. You know? And I think that sometimes the mission of art, or the idea about art, can be a good vehicle, but it also can be a perplexing and confusing vehicle for people trying to address that kind of issue. Because if you don't want to address that idea, the very fact of not addressing that idea is the wall which you build around yourself, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it's quite.
Then there's also the problem of conveying those ideas, because as we might have been mentioning earlier, there's an awful lot of people who have their own ideas about what works for them. I don't know much about art, but I know what I like. And everybody's got that attitude to a degree. In the same way as I'm sure everybody's individuals, and even as artists do, we can't all be, brilliantly porous and open, and people are going to make their mind up about the way they like to do things and stick with that, and maybe not change when they should have done, or whatever. But similarly, that whole idea about just the communication of the world of art with the general population can sometimes go awry.
Yeah.
I think that's one of those, working those issues into public consciousness and being open, having an open dialogue with them and going, oh, actually, because quite often, classically, the thing that jumps into my mind always is there is a public reaction to the bricks of the Tate in whatever it was, 1980, 1981. When those bricks were laid out, and it was just, you must know it, well, it was big over here, it was huge news, it was colossal news actually, it was everywhere, wasn't it?
Well, you call this art?
Yeah, it's rows of bricks, beautifully minimalist, just bricks laid out, really nice, neat bricks in a nice, like 3 deep, was it 2 deep, can't remember, rectangular bricks. and people's views about art were severely challenged by him. People were outraged. It was on the front of tabloids. It was all over the news. It was a huge outcry, I remember. But that sort of symbolises a way that a lot of people still react to modern art. People are still really...
I don't think they do. I mean, I think you're right. I think you might be right at that time, but I think now...
When was this?
You've got...
1980...
Late 70s, early 80s,
Yeah.
that time, yeah.
You see, but now I think art is weirdly quite popular.
Yeah.
You know, if you talk to people about art, and you know, I might say to somebody, it might be the other way around actually. It might be me saying, "Well, I shouldn't really say this live on air, but I might say Grayson Perry really, he's really into entertainment.
Yeah.
Is his love of entertainment really about art, or is he really wants to be this kind of media person?" And then people who perhaps don't know much about art will go, "No, Grayson's good."
Yeah.
They'll be the biggest champions, Grayson Perry.
Yeah.
So it's almost like the other way around. I think you know, you're almost people defend
Artists
Tracy
are more
Evans today.
prejudiced.
They like. It's probably professional jealousy on my part, but they love the shark.
Yeah.
You know, and they're intrigued by the shark. And this shark chopped in, you know, or the cow chopped in half represents a straightforward link to like what life is all about. You know, chopping a cow in half.
Wait, describe this work for us, because maybe not everyone knows.
I'm thinking about Damien Hirst here.
Oh, Hirst, okay.
So Damien Hirst is a populariser of you know, some key ideas. You know, like the meaning of life. You know, summed up in a tank. With he did a mother and child divided, I think it was, which was a pregnant cow.
An actual cow.
An actual cow.
An actual pregnant cow.
Cut in half. And you could, in two tanks, and you walk between them. It's actually an amazing visual experience to see it. But
Again, very
I think
controversial.
those people, and that was a particular era which I lived through, those people, and the idea of shock art, you know, you can't make shock art unless you understand what shocks the populace, you know. And it's not about, you don't shock somebody with something esoteric. You shock something by twisting something that people really understand. And so I sort of think, I take your point about Carl Andre's bricks, but I sort of think things have changed in actually, I think, quite a positive way.
When we talk about galleries, and you know, there's a lot of people use galleries, a lot of people go to galleries, but there is a particular demographic that go to galleries, and I think I just think it's interesting in terms of where art sits, and the conversation it
Is
has.
that an English thing, though?
I don't know. Is it just an English thing?
Oh no! I mean, if you mean galleries per se, then you know, there's a class of people that go to galleries. Lower class people generally just don't feel comfortable there. We'll go to like a big, you know, metropolitan art museum or something like that, and but not to. I mean, I've never even been to the Saatchi Gallery, you know, which probably up to.
Well, you have to pay to get into that now, I think.
No, I don't.
Do you? I don't know. Well, I've never been to the Saatchi Gallery. You know, there's times, you know, I sometimes I'm reliant on friends to, you know,
drag you along.
Drag me along, to open my eyes to things.
But we're very fortunate we're in London. There is a lot of art to go and see, a lot of art that's free to go and see.
Yeah.
So, but what you're saying is that, you know, working class people, maybe they have different forms of artistic activity that they're.
Well, that's what I mean. You know, you can get. I think we can all. It's very difficult to get an idea. I suppose there are surveys done, and I think we'll bear out that sometimes people are intimidated by what's behind a gallery door, but also kind of not going. Oh, yeah, that's not for me. I've seen it.
But you see, I mean, the argument that us in our liberal elite come up with is that more people go to art galleries than go to football matches. That's what we like to say.
Yeah.
That's the statistic we
Wait,
like to
say
talk
that
about.
again?
More people go to art galleries in the UK than go to football matches.
Well, that's amazing, and that's heartening.
That's and it's a true statistic. But I think you see this. But I think it'd be silly not to take on board that idea and take it with some seriousness. That art can appear kind of elitist and only.
Well, there's this old idea that it's really the galleries and the elitism and the social structure of surrounding art that makes art, right? There have been some things where the only way you can explain why that's a work of art is because somebody put it in a gallery, or because some gallery, was willing to exhibit it, right?
Yeah, and also with art, there's a lot of art that's made, which is quite modish, and is bought and sold. Perhaps the people buying it don't know what they're buying. The people selling it think, well, it's great. got a few very wealthy individuals here. We can sell this art to and tell them the story about it. But the thing that's going on, one of the dynamics that's going on, is that art is becoming actually more popular, but a section of art is becoming the kind of person who's producing art is dropping out of it, which is basically people like me who didn't go to a posh school. And the tricky thing is, how do you get us to a situation where art in schools is taken more seriously? Because the only place that you can address that issue is probably not in the art gallery, it's actually in the school. Because it's like teaching musical instruments. So you could say, well, actually we want to take all the children and teach them violin, let's take them to the Royal Opera House. That's nuts. You've got a whole system out there which is schools to teach musical instruments, and that should be the same with art. And then you'll get, if we had a reimagination of the child art movement like there was after the 60s, which I think I was a beneficiary of, and perhaps you were a beneficiary of, where there were lots of, the Cadbury's Art Prize and all sorts of things which you might think of as quite trivial. But if we got that going, if politicians really sort of believed in art, you'd have a much more, a big audience for art. Also, one of the things that happened, I think, after the Second World War, is because of the war, the Bloomsbury Group factor in art, which is all sort of wealthy individuals who are not very good at anything else, can often do art. That died off because all the clever posh kids all got killed flying Spitfires, basically, and and all the clever kids also got killed fighting. So it created enormous opportunities for people, for women in the Second World War, but it also completely exploded who was involved in culture. And people like my parents suddenly began to run art schools in London. My dad, used to mix margarine in the margarine factory in Fulham. But then, so they went through a trajectory which was really quite unique. And it meant that British design exploded in the 1960s. That was because a whole new people with new ideas were invited into culture. If that hadn't happened, we'd all be sitting around on wicker chairs. The changes in culture in the 1940s.
Well, that's it. Those cultural shifts happen, and actually they're outside. They're sometimes outside anyone's control. They occur, and then the result was beneficially in terms of art, that kind of effect.
But what's happening now is that Gove has clobbered the arts in schools. All the foundation courses are closing. I went to the foundation course in Hackney last summer. Well, it was amazing. There wasn't a white kid in there. They were all local Afro-Caribbean kids, all making art and design. It's not just art schools aren't just about art, they're about design and filmmaking and radio production, all those things. They were culled, effectively. They were culled and those that year they turned up at the university where I was, but there aren't kids from that college anymore at the university where I teach, because that college doesn't exist anymore. Where are those kids going? They're not going to explode and do their own thing in culture.
Yeah.
So that is my way of looking at that question about arts elitism. Well, the way to combat that is to take art more seriously at school, and then the other thing about that is that it's also good for democracy, because artists are like a bag of ferrets. You know, we think we think we've come up with all these ideas ourselves. We haven't, but we think we do.
Yeah.
And it means that we have arguments and talk about
Sorry,
things.
do ferrets often have delusions of grandeur?
Ferrets have,
Down the trousers of the politicians. You're a ferret down the trousers of Michael Gove. Roberta Smith.
ferrets,
But that is one of those things that you know that's where at the moment there's a lot you're putting a lot of energy into that, into campaign and into sort of raising the consciousness, you know, with big banners and whatever, you know, all art, you know, this should be an art school, turn Folkestone into an art school, you know, this, you know, and that campaign is another element of how, you know, development from the art flow idea, but into something that's a lot more direct, a lot more along the lines of activism, really. And that's great. You know, there's another proactive, another call to action. All art should be art schools. You know, art is your human right. Let's fight for art. Because you're seeing art, you know, you obviously that's the way I see it. You know, you see art as being under attack, as it is, definitely. You know, and so that's another development of what you do, and that's another place that art's got to. And do we say, oh, that's art, or do we just go, oh, that's just an artist protesting? You know what I mean?
Oh, right.
In terms of stretching the public idea of concepts.
You see, I would say, so there's the developmental aspect of it, and it hasn't ended up, but last time I declared Folkestone an art school. Well, the point about that, and I hadn't realised it at the time, was that for some people, when they got off the train, they looked around and they were like, the world's changed.
Yeah.
For the odd person, they got off the train and they thought, I'm looking at that tree now, and it's become something slightly different.
It changes your perception.
It changes.
You think of it as art.
Yeah, and then you think for yourself, oh, am I an art student? Am I an art lecturer? Am I going to learn something from coming to Folkestone? Am I walking down the slopey ramp into the station? You know, and I hadn't realised that very much, but it summed up something about the Folkestone, you know, triennial project, which is about sticking all these bits of sculpture all everywhere. But if they've done that over time, that would somehow change the town. You know, they're locating all the bits of work. You know, the Anthony Gormley or whatever it is, Tracy Emin pieces. If they're doing that year in, year out, or how does that affect the town? Well, I thought, well, it actually turns the town into somewhere to study. And when I first came up with that idea, I thought, well, it was about the artworks. You know, you're kind of linking all these artworks together and saying, well, this environment that's been created is somewhere to study, like going into a collection, like going to the Tate, or going to the V&A to look at the classroom or something. But then I realised actually it wasn't that. It was actually the buildings, the trees, the people. It was kind of everything really, and I got excited about that. I sort of thought that's a really amazing thing to do. So the next thing is to think, well, I mean, it's completely hubristic, but to think the world is an art school. You know, if you think about something different, suddenly it changes. I mean, I don't know if that's true. I mean, I don't know philosophically whether that holds any water, but you know, you can change things by thinking about them in different ways, can't you? Certainly that happens with people, don't you? You talk to people, you know, you think, oh, what's that person like? I don't really know. You might get into conversation with them, but they suddenly change. That's because they're probably emitting something that you like or you're interested by. But that sense of, or understanding how you know, a piece of kit works. You know, and I'm not sure if there's something terribly philosophical going on there, but somehow with your curiosity, you're looking at the physical world, and that physical thing in front of you is evolving in some sort of strange way.
And I think that, I mean, taking...
Certainly by drinking this wine,
Yeah.
the whole world has changed.
Yeah. And that's it, because things like that happening in Folkestone, even if it's just because they're the sort of things that, as a creative, as people who will latch onto the arts in one way or another, if they get an opportunity or they glimpse that, that is a step away from the kind of metropolitan elitism that art can fall prey to, I think, you know, moving it out into Folkestone, having it in other areas. You know, we've had this conversation before about the idea of things happening in grassroots areas, in Morecambe, in Mansfield. They're the places that you need to connect with people as well. So taking art out into that situation, maybe not, you know, and maybe it's not going to be earth-shattering, but it might make somebody think, oh, I can go into theatre, I can, you know, music.
But I think it's this thing. I think it's what you identified it earlier. This, you know, this idea about porosity or
open concept.
Yeah, if you could, I mean, can you make that a physical thing? You know, in a way, maybe the idea about doing it, saying that Folkestone was an art school was a way of saying we're turning this place into a physical place into an open concept. You know, it's going to change. You're going possibilities are going to arise here.
Yeah, I mean, our concept of what an art school could be changes, and maybe our concept of what Folkestone is changes.
I think. I mean, obviously, I'm the inventor of that particular artwork, but I do think that it did something which was quite profound, actually.
Wait, what's the artwork here?
So the artwork is declaring Folkestone an art school.
So it's just that act of declaring Folkestone.
Yeah, but I did actually set up an art school for the duration of the exhibition, which was completely open. So we did try and teach 12 young people, give them a foundation, like a taste of what it would be like to go to art school. But everybody was invited into there to make art. It's mostly children and young people made things, but adults could make things. The materials, it was just providing a whole shitload of materials, so you could do what you wanted with a bit of paper and some pencils, basically.
So I think conceptualists would maybe say that all of those actions were sort of the vehicle of the artwork, but the art itself just consisted in the concept of thinking of Folkestone as an art school, right? Mm.
Well, I am a bit confused about it. I think the whole thing, you know, like the art party, you know, I want to sort of grab hold of the whole thing. I don't want to appropriate it. I think that's a thorny can of worms. But I want to claim that idea, you know, that Folkestone is an art school as an artwork. You know, I mean, I don't know quite how it pans out, but I think
I like it.
I think we've got to.
I don't know much about art, but I know what I like.
Well, you know, part of it is inspired by Leytonstone. I mean, Leytonstone. This is to do with gentrification. Maybe it's to do with gentrification in Folkestone. I don't know. But it's to do with thinking about things in different terms. I think about Leytonstone in a completely different way than when I moved here. Maybe 20 years ago. Which is very interesting, I think. You know, I think about it as I used to think about it as a desperate place where I was living on the in the boondocks in a kind of crummy place where when I lived in Hackney, I never thought I'd live in Leytonstone. Now I think about it, it's this enormous place of aspiration. It's so exciting to live here. We can pop next door and make a radio show.
Exactly.
And I just think, and that actually, although that could be a Guardian article. And also who you are and where you are and your networks, and I think all that is kind of rich and interesting, actually.
Yeah, no, and that's lovely, that sense of evolution and porosity. And, as we've managed to absorb our wine,
We absorbed it.
We've been
Coming
pretty
to the end
porous,
here.
yeah. We seem to have reached a natural conclusion, but you know, it's been lovely talking about that, and also getting a sense
You've got all these great images here in these books.
of
I
that
know.
evolution.
Yeah, you were talking about like all the imagery in the 60s, right?
Yeah,
That sort of burst
yeah,
out.
well, it's a wonderful Russian
War.
show. And,
Yeah.
that's for Jones.
So much to enjoy, and you know, it's an open-ended subject. You know, it's constantly evolving, it's constantly changing, and that's one of the beauties of it, which is not something I've been thinking about, because you're always trying to pin something down. You're always trying to, I am anyway, trying to.
It's certainly what
Fine.
philosophers like to do.
We do,
right?
we do, but
Devise
it's a slippery fish, you know, and it's also a changing fish, and that's what I think is really exciting about it, because you never will pin it down, because it'll always be growing, it'll always be making a shift and change our consciousness to adapt to all these new ideas that are coming into it. So all power to that, I say. And thanks very much for coming on.
Yeah,
I'm amazed, honoured to be here.
It's been
Great having a chat, and we hope you come back again. We can talk about
That's good,
some
yes.
more.
Yeah. Did we
in
get
the
another
future.
song?
We
Do I
do.
get to play the,
Get to play the corkscrew.
Shall we? Oh yeah, yeah. Please join us on the corkscrew.
Yeah.
Shall we play a little longer? And you want to take a little uke solo? Can you do?
We can try,
We
yeah.
can try it. Why not?
Okay.
Jason on the uke.
2, 3.